Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ohio EPA's 2022 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. My name is Cindy DeWolf, and I'm with the Division of Air Pollution Control here at Ohio EPA, and I will be moderating air permitting for major sources. Ohio EPA's 2022 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference has 24 sessions over 2 weeks. Today, this is the final of 3 sessions focusing on air pollution control. Registration information and a conference agenda are located on Ohio EPA's conference webpage. We hope you can join us for additional conference sessions. Please remember, it's never too late to sign up for the next conference session, and all sessions are being recorded for you to view later. I would like to point your attention to one of today's environmental fun facts. On this slide, we are highlighting a new hazardous air pollutant that's been added to the list. This past January, US EPA added 1-bromopropane to the list of hazardous air pollutants, or HAP list. 1-bromopropane is the first new HAP added in more than 30 years and is used in electronics and metal cleaning, surface coating, and dry cleaning. This change will impact air permitting and modeling requirements. To learn more, please scan the QR code on this slide to receive more information about this new addition to the HAP list. And now I would like to introduce our speakers, Bob Hodanbosi and Mike Maleski in the Division of Air Pollution Control. Bob Hodanbosi became chief of the Division of Air Pollution Control in September of 1992. As chief, he is responsible for Ohio's air pollution control program and development of the programs needed to comply with the Clean Air Act amendments. Prior to that, Bob held various positions within the division. We also have Mike Maleski, who's been with Ohio EPA since 2012 and is currently an Environmental Specialist 3 in DAPC's permitting section. He is responsible for reviewing Title V permits, permits to install and operate for Central Ohio and Toledo, and also updating the racked-backed layer clearinghouse. With that, I will turn it over to Bob Hodanbosi and Mike Maleski.
Good afternoon, and this is Bob Hodanbosi, and I'm going to be starting off before I hand it off to Mike. And some of the things that we are going to cover this afternoon are the basic understanding of what major new source review permitting is about, understanding attainment and non-attainment areas and how they affect the permits, the basics of the prevention of significant deterioration program, plus there is some additional bonus material that we would not have time to cover that is attached. So first, what is major new source review permitting? What is this about? Both state and federal regulations require that new sources obtain a permit before they begin installation. And this could be either a brand new facility or a modified facility. If the emissions are large enough, then the installation is referred to as a major new source permit, and that's just a generic term, major new source review. Major new source review includes 2 categories. One is the prevention of significant deterioration regulations in attainment areas, or non-attainment new source review in non-attainment areas. And our rules in Ohio EPA, they were drafted and they incorporate in all of the federal concepts that they have, that US EPA has for major new source review, such that when you have a permit from Ohio EPA, it is going to be consistent with US EPA's regulations. And in fact, we have an approved prevention of significant deterioration program for the state. So what's the difference between attainment and non-attainment? I mean, on the surface, when an area meets the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAICS, and we'll talk about the NAICS in just a second, it's referred to as an attainment area. When we have violations of those ambient air quality standards, it's designated as a non-attainment area. Now, for new source review purposes, it's possible for a new installation to be treated as attainment for some pollutants and non-attainment for others. It just depends on what the pollutant is and what the specific category is for that pollutant. Now, the entire state is attainment for PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is particulate matter less than 2.5 micron, nitrogen dioxides, carbon monoxide, and lead. Ohio has non-attainment areas for ozone and SO2. Here's the map that illustrates where we had and have ozone non-attainment. One of the things that happened was in 2015, US EPA lowered the ozone standard from 0.75 parts per million to 0.70 parts per million. And that started a designation process. And at one point, Cincinnati area, the Columbus area, and the Cleveland area were all designated non-attainment. But currently, only Cleveland is designated non-attainment for the ozone standard. And the Cleveland area is the 7 counties up in Northeast Ohio. That's shown on this map. One of the things that I mentioned before, US EPA keeps tightening the standards down for ozone. Back in 1997, we had a standard of 0.08 parts per million, and we met that standard and we were redesignated. Then it went down to 0.75, and we met that standard and we were redesignated. And now the standard is at 0.70 parts per million. And as I mentioned, we aren't meeting it in Cleveland, but the Columbus and Cincinnati areas have been redesignated. For SO2, we only have a small non-attainment area in the corner of Washington and Morgan counties, where formerly the Muskingum River plant was located. So the non-attainment area for SO2 is quite small, and it's on a sub-county basis. So where does non-attainment new source review apply? The non-attainment new source review applies where US EPA has designated those areas as non-attainment, and it applies for the non-attainment pollutant and precursor emissions. And Mike will talk a little bit about the precursor emissions. Some areas may violate the standards, but are not yet designated non-attainment. Those fall under the prevention of significant deterioration rules. Other non-attainment areas meet the standards, but the redesignation process, we have to prepare a detailed package to show not that we've just attained the standard, but we're going to maintain it 10 years in the future. And that's not a quick process. So even though we might have attainment air quality, until that area is designated as attainment, it still falls under the non-attainment new source review requirements. And where does PSD apply? It applies in those other areas that are designated either as attainment or non-classifiable. US EPA does have some areas that they put into a non-classifiable category when there's just not enough data out there for them to say one way or another. And those are treated as attainment. And again, this only applies to attainment pollutants and precursor emissions. So it is possible for a large project to have non-attainment new source review for a pollutant or two, say VOCs for ozone, and PSD for other pollutants, say, SO2. So it is possible to have both a PSD permit and a non-attainment permit for the same project. Okay, let's take a quick poll. Do you live in a non-attainment area for any pollutant? And I know we have people from out of state, and we didn't cover areas outside of Ohio, but maybe you know, even if you are outside of Ohio.
Okay, we've launched the poll, so please take a moment to choose yes or no. We have about 80% of you responding so far, so we will close the poll in just a moment. So please enter your response.
Okay, it looks like the majority of our people participating today live in an attainment area. They don't have any non-attainment, so that is good. For the people in the non-attainment areas, we are working towards trying to meet those standards so that you would be classified as attainment. So thank you for that. And now we're going to get to prevention of significant deterioration. I'm going to turn it over to Mike Maleski.
Hello. Now let's go into the prevention of significant deterioration rules, which apply in attainment areas, which from the last poll looks like the majority of people are in those areas. So basically, there's a general overview of what we're going to cover here is look at the regulatory goals of the PSD program. There's several important terms that go in this program to allow you to navigate through the rules, allows you to navigate through the applicability and the requirements, and we'll just give a general review of PSD afterwards. The program goals on a regulatory standpoint is designed to keep attainment areas in attainment, but to still allow some economic growth for new industries that emit additional pollutants, and also to preserve what we call Class 1 areas. These are the special areas, and these are large national wilderness areas and memorial parks. There's none in Ohio, but there's some outside of the state, so we have to look at those as well. Here's some of the important terms. First one is a regulated NSR pollutant. Basically, it's your national ambient air qualities, NAICS pollutants, any constituents, and precursors. Also includes Section 111 pollutants. Section 111 is a section of the Clean Air Act, and it's basically the NSPSs. It includes some ozone depleting substances and any other Clean Air Act regulated pollutant. Basically, this covers your carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, VOCs, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, PM10 and PM2.5 are your typical ones. There are some less common ones for PSD purposes, and that includes lead, fluorides, sulfuric acid mist, hydrogen sulfide, total reduced sulfur, and non-methane organic compounds from landfills, also known as NMOC. Another very key term is potential to emit. And potential emit is the maximum capacity of an emission unit to emit at whatever its designed capacity is. Now, this is something that can be limited through federally enforceable means, and we'll get into the federally enforceable part here in a second, but that includes control devices, any limits on the hours or capacity of the unit. You can have like a production capacity, limits on the amount of fuel you use or how much is stored. Like say if there's an operation that only operates 5 days a week, you can take a limit on, for 5 days a week versus 7 days a week. Let's back up a little bit. Let's get a little bit more into federally enforceable. Means that any limitations you take are federally enforceable, which means it's based either on a federal rule or a SIP rule, such as if you have like a Chapter 21 VOC limitation, and those requirements are designated as federally enforceable and permits that have been issued draft and final. Another key definition is stationary sources. And there's a three-pronged test that you have to answer these questions to be considered a stationary source. One, they must belong to the same industrial grouping, which is the SIC code. They must be located on one or more contiguous or adjacent properties and be under common control. As you can imagine, there's these terms can be a little bit vague, and there's lots of US EPA guidance to help you guide your way through determining if you are a stationary source. One of the bigger keys is if it's located on contiguous or adjacent properties. There is a US EPA new source review policy and guidance document index, and it can give you a lot of guidance for different specific scenarios on this. I would highly recommend if you have some odd situations that you want to go and check those. Major stationary source. There's another key term. Your criteria is for a major stationary source. If you are in one of 28 source categories, which I'll touch on in a minute here, your criteria for to be major is 100 tons per year of any regulated NSR pollutant. If you're not one of those 28 source categories, the criteria is 250 tons per year. Those source categories are typically some of your old, larger emission units, such as cement kilns, iron and steel mills, petroleum refineries, lime plants, and coke ovens. Also, one thing to note, greenhouse gases cannot be the sole reason for you to be a major stationary source. You have to trip PSD or be a major stationary source for a for a regulated NSR pollutant. So once you're major for regulated NSR, then you look at greenhouse gases. Some things to note. If you're yet cannot forget VOC emissions. It's rather easy to forget that because there's no ambient air quality standard for VOC. It's actually under ozone, and VOC is a precursor to ozone. A couple other things. One, fugitive emissions. You do not count fugitive emissions when determining your potential emit for the applicability unless you are one of the 28 source categories. Also, one other thing to note, that list of 28 source categories is not specific to just NSPSs. So you have to keep that in mind. And this is also one other thing that kind of can fall through the cracks a little bit, is if you have a change at your source and that change isn't in itself a major major source, then the project is a major stationary source. So if you have a project that is either 100 tons per year or 250 tons per year, depending on if you in one of the 28 source categories, then you are a major stationary source. There's a rather lengthy definition of major modification in our rules. I'll try to make a brief overview of it. So for a major modification, you have to meet two criteria. Well, actually three criteria. First, you have to have a physical change or a change in the method of operation of a source that results in a significant emissions increase and a significant emissions increase, a significant net emissions increase, excuse me. The first criteria there is if it's a physical change or change in the method of operation. So we'll get a little bit more into that here in a minute. First, for a change itself must be above the significant levels and the net change be above the significance levels. Significance levels are for carbon monoxides 100 tons per year. For nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide and VOC is 40 tons per year. Particulate matter is 25 tons per year. PM10 is 15 and PM2.5 is 10. For the other pollutants I mentioned, the less common ones, I might want to go ahead and check the definitions. We'll get the significance level for those pollutants. Once again, remember, don't forget VOC. It's included in one of the significance levels, so it's a little bit easier to remember there. There's also, have to keep in mind that there's different calculation methods for determining what your significant emission increase is. For a existing emission units, you look at the actual emissions to projected actual. If it's a new emissions unit, you look at the potential emissions. As I kind of alluded to earlier, one of the criteria is that you have a physical change or change in the method of operation qualifiers. There's several exemptions for this. This is, for instance, this does not include routine maintenance and repair or alternative fuels or raw materials that the source was capable of accommodating with. So one thing I also recommend if you have situations like this is to check the US EPA new source review guidance and the past applicability determinations. As you can imagine, there's a lot of specific examples that can really help and determine if you actually do have a physical change or change in the method of operation. There's also a plant-wide applicability limit qualifier or PAL limits. Basically, if you have a facility with a PAL, you only are subject to PSD is if you exceed your PAL limit. Right now, I believe there's only 2 facilities in the state that have PALs. Okay, let's get into applicability of PSD. So first thing you need to do is determine if your proposed source, this is for new facilities, if your proposed new facility is a major stationary source for any of the any pollutant, and that's the 100 or 250 ton criteria. Also note if you exceed those thresholds for one pollutant, your major stationary source for all the pollutants. As we go in here, it says if any of the attainment pollutants trip the major threshold, then you're considered major for everything. If you are major, don't forget to check greenhouse gases, but greenhouse gases alone will not put you into PSD. For existing facilities, you have to determine if your existing facility is a major stationary source. If it is, then you have to determine that if you actually have a physical change or change in the method of operation. Then at that point, you would do the 2-part emissions test for each pollutant, which we'll get into a little bit more in the next slide. First, you have to determine the emissions increase for each pollutant to determine if it's a significant emissions increase. Then you will determine the net emissions increase for that pollutant. We're not really going to get into the net emissions increase during this training. It can get rather complicated because you have to look back at past emissions. It can get rather complicated. Also, once again, sound like a broken record, but don't forget to look at greenhouse gases if you exceed PSD for other pollutants. Here's a good example. It's good to put some of the words I'm putting into an actual example. So we have, if you look in the left column, you have an existing facility with potential emissions listed there. The potential emissions of NOx are 251 tons, and that is over a 250-ton threshold. Thus, it is a major stationary source. So you meet the first criteria. For points of, for this example, we're going to assume that there has been a physical change. So you would look at both the emissions increase and the net emissions increase versus each individual threshold for those pollutants. And those are all listed in the second to last column. So if you look at the emissions increases, only VOC and SO2 exceed their triggers. But if you also look, the netting increase of VOCs is less than the trigger. So that does not trip PSD. NOx and PM 2.5, those emission increases are less than the trigger, but the net emissions increases are both. They both have to exceed, so those are not PSD. Only SO2, which has a net emissions increase and an emissions increase above the thresholds, is subject to PSD. Can get a little bit complicated, but you have to pass all of those criteria to be a PSD source. As I noted to earlier, net emissions increase can get really complicated. I would highly recommend you you would get in contact with your permit writer and your local air agency or district office to get that established first, because if this is wrong, this is the basis for your permit or any permit you may or may not need. So it's best to get this one nailed down first and go from there. Because if you think that it's not subject and turns out it is subject, then you could have some problems because you went through a modification without a permit. Sorry, I seem to have an itchy trigger finger. Okay, there's some important considerations in terms of fugitive emissions. First thing you have to do is define what a fugitive emission is. If you look here in the definition, we have emissions that cannot reasonably pass through a stack chimney or vent. It doesn't say that it does pass through those, it says that reasonably cannot pass through. So some examples we have of sources that cannot pass through a stack or chimney are material stockpiles, road dust, or emissions from like quarries or mines, or fugitive equipment leaks from like valves and flanges at refineries or chemical plants. As we noted earlier, that you include fugitive emissions in on the calculation for potential to emit if you're one of the 28 source categories. However, if you have determined that you are major for that pollutant, you're going through PSD, you do have to include fugitive emissions, regardless if you include them in your PTE or not, for any of the air quality impact analysis. And now secondary emissions. Secondary emissions are emissions that aren't associated directly with the facility. Those can be like the construction operations, or if you have some ancillary, some separate facilities that are like providing like the raw materials to the facility. Those aren't included, but you have to include them in any PSD analysis. So we're going to get a little bit into the PSD requirements. Briefly, we'll get into it first. You have to employ best available control technology or BACT. You may have to do some ambient monitoring to perform your emissions modeling. However, Ohio has a pretty extensive ambient monitoring network and likely has the background information that you would need for your modeling. You also have to do other impact analysis that could include impacts on Class 1 areas, as I mentioned earlier. There's a lot more information included in the Bones materials that can be referenced in the slide or the additional material option in the GoToWebinar. So let's take a quick poll. Have you ever applied for a PSD permit?
Okay, we've launched the poll, so please take a moment and select an answer, yes or no. Okay, we have about 70% of you have responded. Please take a moment and answer, and then we'll close the poll in just a moment. Okay, we are now closing the poll, and I will share the results with you. Thank you.
Okay, looking at the results, 80% of you have not applied for a PSD permit. That's not surprising. PSD permits are really large permits for really large modifications, and we typically do not receive too many of these per year. So I can't say I'm surprised by that result. Okay, if you have any questions, enter them in a question pane that's on the control panel to the, I believe it's on the right of your screen. And now back to Bob so we can finish this presentation up here for PSD.
Great. Thank you, Mike. The prevention of significant deterioration rules have been around since the late 70s, and there's been a number of important court cases and revisions to the rules and enforcement cases that the program's evolved over time. And one of the big decisions that happened a number of years ago was something about netting. And let's say that you are responsible for a facility that is currently emitting 500 tons of VOC emissions. So you are clearly, doesn't matter what source category you're in, you are clearly a major emitting facility. So it turns out that your corporation has decided that they are going to put in some new equipment, and that new equipment is going to be emitting 350 tons a year, and that would clearly trigger PSD. However, the new equipment going in is a lot more efficient, and it's going to be able to produce more. It's going to be an expansion in terms of production, but it's going to be very well controlled with robots and thermal oxidizers more than your existing facility. And so you are going to be closing down the 500 ton per year part of your plant and replacing it with 350 tons. So that you can then quote net out of PSD. Although I'm maybe oversimplifying it because there has to be conditions on the new permit on the new source that's building, and there has to be making sure those were actual emissions that were being shut down and all. But this concept of netting has been used in many cases in order for a facility not to have to go through formally PSD, because in the big picture, the emissions are not going up from that particular facility, but in fact, they are going down. So it has been used in expansions or some replacements. And in some cases, expansions work in that there is an installation coming in and someone's going to build some new equipment, but they are going to, I would say, oversize the control and control some of the existing sources that are now uncontrolled, and they'll all be controlled. So overall, the emissions from that facility are going to go down, even with the new equipment. Again, that's a situation where you potentially can net out of PSD. But where it doesn't work are greenfield facilities. If you are having a expansion, and that expansion is not on the same piece of property as your existing facility, it doesn't work. It could be just 4 or 5 miles away from your existing facility. It doesn't work. It has to be at that same particular location. But this is a tool that is used by quite a bit of facilities to try to make sure that they do not have to trip PSD and go through all the requirements of PSD. But typically, they're going to end up having good controls on anyway in order to make sure that this actually can work. So here are some key takeaways. Major new source review permitting applies to the installation of new or modified sources at large facilities. PSD applies to the areas that are formally designated as attainment, and non-attainment new source review applies to the areas that are formally designated as non-attainment. The rules are complex. If it turns out that you are going to trip PSD, you are going to trip non-attainment new source review, it is worth your while to hire a consultant. You should be contacting Ohio EPA soon, but also working with a consultant, because if there's modeling that's needed, air quality dispersion modeling that's needed, you will need somebody that has experience in doing that work, that has gone through the PSD process in order to be able to get an application put together in a timely fashion. So we recommend that once you understand that you've tripped PSD, that you, or non-attainment new source review, that you hire a experienced consulting firm to assist you in preparing the application. Some additional resources that are out there. The 1990 New Source Review Workshop Manual, and I know it says 1990, but that's still what US EPA relies on. There's a lot of good information there on what goes on with major new source review. We have information in our rules and information for who the designated county is. Are they covered by one of our district offices or local air agencies? Thank you. And you can enter your questions in the question panel if you have any coming up. And with that, I will turn it back over to Mike.
Okay, now we're going to get into part 2 of this presentation, and that's going to cover Title V. So basically, we're going to try to cover what is a Title V permit, how to get one, how to modify one, how to renew one, and how to get help with one. So we're going to cover all those topics here. First, what is a Title V permit? A Title V permit is an operating permit only, does not cover the installation, but it is a single operating permit for what are considered large air pollution sources. And this requirement is from the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, particularly Title V of those Clean Air Act amendments. And we will get a little bit more into what a large source is in a minute. But basically, that Title V permit is a single operating permit that basically contains all of your requirements. Includes all your subject emission units, all the emission limits, your restrictions, all your monitoring, record keeping, and reporting, and any testing requirements. It applies to your entire facility. If you have a source that's not subject to a Title V permit, they may and likely do have several permits that apply to the whole facility. They may apply to each individual emission unit or groups of emission units, but for a Title V permit, it is one operating permit for everything. So who needs to get a Title V permit? A facility that's considered a major Title V source. So what is a major Title V source? Now, I'd like to point out major is defined differently than from what PSD is. So you have to look specifically when we're talking about these different terms as to what program it applies to. So for Title V, it is 100 tons per year of any regulated pollutant, which includes PM10, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, CO, VOCs, or lead. Or it's 10 tons of any single hazardous air pollutant, or 25 tons per year of your total hazardous air pollutants. There's a US EPA has a list of, I believe it's now 189 pollutants of hazardous air pollutants, of which we just discussed there was a new addition to that. So also note that this is going to be based on a potential to emit, which is another term we have to define. So what is a potential to emit? It similar to PSD, it is the maximum capacity emissions unit using the maximum production, maximum operating hours. It can include air pollution control equipment or any other restrictions if they're federally enforceable or legally and practically enforceable by the state. So federally enforceable restriction, it could include a federally enforceable rule such as NSPS, or it can be a state rule if it's approved in the state implementation plan, the SIP, which includes something like Chapter 21 VOC limits. If you have a VOC limit in the rule of 3.5 pounds per gallon, you do include that as a federally enforceable limitation on your potential to emit. And also, it can be included in if you have limits that are included in a federally enforceable permit that's been issued draft and final, those limitations can also be included. So here's the actual regulatory definition of potential emit that is included in Chapter 77, which is Ohio's Title V rules. As you can see, basically, I already mentioned it's the maximum potential, maximum capacity, maximum throughput of the emissions unit, and maximum hours. And you include any limitations that, assuming they are federally enforceable or legally and practically enforceable by the state. So I guess the next question is, how do you figure out what your potential is? So you have to do this calculation for each emissions unit, for each pollutant at your facility. So if you have a really large facility, this can be a very extensive calculation. So you make sure we're going to do it for each of your criteria pollutants and for hazardous air pollutants, pretty much all the Title V pollutants that were mentioned earlier. Actually, back up a sec. What you want to do is you want to calculate those emissions using controls and maximum capacity. Then when you do that, you go through and determine if there's any physical or operational restrictions that apply, and that are those where those restrictions are considered fairly enforceable or practically enforceable. You also want to check to see if you have any rules that also apply to it. And you'll want to sum this together for your entire facility and measure yourself versus those thresholds of 100 tons per year for your criteria pollutants, or 10 and 25 tons for single HAPs or combined HAPs. So there's potentially other triggers for Title V program. Any source subject to Subject 111, which is the NSPS, this has been revised a little bit. We're pretty much only specific and only NSPSs that have specific requirements that require you get a Title V permit. And any source subject to Section 112, those are your max standards. Some of the MAC standards apply to major sources, which are going to be have potential emissions of over 10 tons of a single HAP or 25 tons of your total HAPs. Those will have to get a Title V permit. But for the majority of non-major MACs or GAC sources, those do not have to get Title V permits. If you're utilities, you have to get them. And there's also a couple other sources that are included in the federal definition that's under 40 CFR Part 70.3. But generally, the categories I went above are those are the major triggers for Title V. And here's Chapter 77 are our rules that apply. Also, actually would like to jump back and in terms of potential to omit, legally and practically enforceable, those, if you have a permit that includes a short-term or rolling 12-month emission limitations or operating restrictions that have sufficient parametric monitoring on like control equipment or those restrictions, those can be considered your legally and practically enforceable restrictions. We do have a couple engineering guides on our website that go into a lot of details on how do you calculate potential emit for different rule categories and for different sources. Those are under Engineering Guide 61 and Engineering Guide 80. Okay, now we're going to get into some of the what it takes to actually prepare a permit and what it takes for us to process them. As you can imagine, since this is a single permit application for your entire facility, if you have a really large facility, it can take some time to put this application together. You have to have different application forms that get into details about what your emission unit is, including process flow diagrams. And once you submit that to us, it can take us a long time to process them. If it's a really complex facility, it could take 18 months to process those. Typically, we can turn around much faster than that since this program has been on the ground for a while. And for a lot of facilities that already have Title V permits, we already had the base permit already set up, and same thing with PTI. So that doesn't quite take that long anymore. Also notice these permits are good for 5 years and they do not have automatic renewal. So you will have to submit a renewal on these with between 6 to 18 months prior to them expiring. Unlike permits to install or any other installation permits, there's no fee associated with obtaining this permit, but you will have to pay fees based on your actual emissions every year. The fee for this current year is $54.37 per ton, and you pay that fee on I forget which pollutants you have. Not carbon monoxide. Include I lost the list here. Bear with me. You pay your fees on SO2 emissions, NOx emissions, organic compounds, lead, and particulate emissions. So how do you apply for a permit? For some sources in the past, you were able to apply using paper forms. That is no longer the case. If you are a Title V facility, you have to apply for them electronically through our air services system. That's part of what we call Ohio EPA's e-Business Center. Your application will be submitted to there. Your compliance certifications, all of your information will go through this system. So let's take a quick poll. Have you ever applied for a Title V permit?
Okay, we've launched the poll, and please answer yes or no. It looks like 70% of you have responded. So for those of you who have not yet responded, please go ahead and submit your response, and we'll close the poll in just a moment. Okay, the poll is now closed, and I will share the response.
Okay, looks like it's about a 50-50 split of facilities that are major sources that have Title V permits and ones that are not. I say I'm a little bit surprised. I thought there might have been a little bit more Title V sources. Okay, so let's get into the steps of how do you actually obtain a Title V permit. So the first thing you have to do is naturally you submit your application, and Ohio EPA reviews and we create a permit. Now, normally if you have like a PTI or a PTIO, those permits are either issued direct final or they're issued draft and final. For Title V, they go through a few more steps. First step is to issue the permit draft, and both the applicant, the public, and US EPA are afforded the opportunity to provide comments, and that is a 30-day comment period. The next step, we would review those comments, incorporate any revisions into the next stage of the permit, and issue it as a preliminary proposed permit, which allows the applicant, only the applicant, to review the permit, and they have a 14-day comment period for that. Then we will look at any comments on those, modify the permit if necessary. Then we'll issue the permit as a preliminary proposed permit, which is only for US EPA comments, and they have 45 days to provide comments. Then once they provide comments, if any, then the final permit is issued. So what does the permit contain? Well, in a nutshell, it contains everything. It includes all rules that apply to every emission unit at the facility, includes the emission limits or any operational restrictions you may have, plus all your monitoring, record keeping, reporting, and testing requirements. In a little bit more detail, it includes a general cover letter that tells you basically some of the administrative stuff of the permit. Then it has a table of contents and also includes the standard terms and conditions, plus all of your emission unit and facility-wide terms. I'd like to take a second here to point out that, ask you to remember to review your standard terms and conditions. Those are pretty easy to skip over and just look straight into your emission unit terms. So make sure you read them. There are requirements in there that can have a tendency for facilities can forget. So definitely make sure you review those terms. So what are the major obligations on the permit? Well, first, if you do not have a Title V permit and you're required to get one, you do not have legal authority to operate. So you actually have to have this permit in place. And this also documents what you need to do to operate all your emission units in compliance with all the limits and in compliance with your Title V permit. And also lays out what monitoring or any other requirements you have to do to comply with those limits. It also includes any scheduling you may have for any emissions testing, what methods you have to submit reports, how you submit them, which is good to read your standard terms and conditions because it tells you how to submit your reports. And also with Title V includes a annual compliance certification where you certify compliance or non-compliance with all the emission limits and all the terms of your permit. So now that you see all the process that goes through a Title V, and you determine you do not want any part of it, what do you have to do to get out of it? Basically, you have to look at your potential limit for your facility. If it's above the major source thresholds, you have to figure out ways that you can limit that potential limit to get under the major stationary source thresholds. And that's the 100 tons per year for criteria pollutants, or 10 and 25 for single HAPs or combined HAPs. Some things you can do is you can look at some operational restrictions, such as operating time. Like if you only operate 5 days a week, or maybe 1 or 2 shifts, you can take limitations on those. You can also limit the amount of material you process. If you make, if your facility makes widgets, you can take limitations on how many widgets you produce every year. You can also add emission controls to get you under the limit, and obtain restrictions on those controls to make them fairly enforceable. You can revise the process if you need to. You can use different materials such as lower VOC content coatings, or other revisions you can make that will actually lower your potential limit to below the threshold. So once you do that, you actually have to get a permit that memorializes all those changes and makes them fairly enforceable. So what you'll do is you can get a what we call a permit to install and operate, a PTIO. Those are for sources that are not subject to the Title V program. And as I mentioned earlier, you can have multiple PTIOs to cover either one emission unit or groups of emission units at your facility. And for any units where you want to obtain limits to avoid Title V, you'll get what is called a federally enforceable permit to install and operate, or what we now call a FEPTIO. So you'll have restrictions and monitoring, record keeper reporting to show that you are in compliance with those restrictions. So if you have a Title V permit and you want to make some changes to your facility, what process do you have to go through to do that? First thing you need to do is you determine what needs to change. One thing you have to kind of look at is, you have to look at, while looking at what changes you want to make to your facility, you have to really look at what changes do you have to make in your Title V permit, because that's kind of the key to determine what method you use to revise your Title V permit. This will make a little bit more sense here when I go over the different methods and different means to revise your Title V permit. And if you have any changes you're not sure, as always, contact your permit writer. We'd be more than happy to go through some of the details of what you have to do, or whatever the best ways to go through and modify your permit. In many cases, you may need to get a PTI first, depending on what kind of modification. If you're installing a new source or making some modification to your existing source, you may need to get a PTI first. Okay, now we'll get into the different modification types for your permits. First, we'll get into off-permit changes. We have here non-conflicting PTIs. That's kind of a fancy term for new emission units. For any exemptions or any other changes you make that are not addressed or prohibited in a permit. Kind of I was looking at before, mentioning before, you have to kind of look at not so much the change of facility is how this actually impacts your current Title V permit. So that's why this is called an off-permit change, because none of these changes are actually in your Title V permit. So basically what you can do is you can, if it's a source, like say if you have a new source and you have to, and you go through and obtain a PTI, you can start operation of that source when you get the PTI. Then you have 12 months to submit your Title V app. You have the option of just having your PTI get included in a state-only side of permit. If you want it incorporated completely into the permit as the federally enforceable side, you go through the minor permit modification procedure. This is typical. Okay, for administrative permits amendments, these are typically typos, or actually it's more used for facility name changes. So what you do is you can submit your application, and you can begin operating when you submit that application. If you're just a name change, there's really no real change in the way you operate, so you just go as you were before. All right, we're going to skip the next two and go straight to reopenings because the middle two, the minor permit mods and significant permit mods, are a little bit more detailed. But reopenings basically they're used to include new applicable requirements. Say if you have a MAC standard that applies to you, or any other, like say if you have a new rule, like a new MAC standard, or if the MAC standard is changed, your permit will need to be reopened to include those requirements. In terms of when they're effective, it's really going to be based on when those requirements become effective, regardless if they're included in your Title V permit or not. So if there's a new MAC that comes out, you have to comply with it when the MAC standard says you have to comply with it. But you have to also get that included in your permit. And that permit must go through all 4 stages of the issuance: the draft, preliminary, proposed, and final stages. We'll get into the other modifications here in just a second, but here's a pie chart that generally shows the percentage of modifications we get and how they get classified. The majority of our modifications fall into minor permit mods and administrative permit amendments. So let's take a quick poll again. Have you ever submitted an application to modify a Title V permit after the Zone A goes to the 50%? So we know we can't have any more than that. So off to you, Cindy.
Okay, we've launched the poll, and please take a moment to answer yes or no. Okay, about 60% of you have responded. For those that have not yet responded, please go ahead and submit your answer, yes or no, and then we'll close the poll in just a moment. Okay, the poll is now closed, and I will share the results and turn it back over to Mike.
Okay, looks like about 60% of you have not had to modify your Title V permit yet. That's probably about typical of what I would expect. We don't get a whole lot of modifications. Okay, now we're going to go into the significant permit modifications. These are the 2 categories that I did not really get much information into yet. A significant permit mod is used for changes that typically include changes to existing units that are above a Title I modification level. I will get into that a little bit more. Or significant changes in monitoring or relaxation of record keeping or reporting terms. As noted before, sometimes you have to look at this in terms of what changes you're actually making to your permit, not so much as what you're making to your facility. And you want to incorporate any new units that qualify as a Title I modification. Basically, these are the modifications that you have to go for PSD or major non-attainment new source review, or NSPS or MAC modification sources. As I was getting into Title I modifications, NSPS, there's a definition of modification listed in the general provisions of the NSPS. And for HAP sources, similar. If your potential emit is increased and it's considered a construction or reconstruction as defined in 40 CFR 6341. Also, Title I modifications include PSD sources, whether it be new or existing. If it's PSD, it's going to be a significant permit modification. Same thing with non-attainment new source review. That will also be a significant permit modification. So how do you go through this procedure? You'll submit a complete application for the change via air services. This is in addition to any requirements you'd have to do for a PTI. That permit will have to go through all 4 phases of issuance: the draft, preliminary, proposed, and final. And only the portions of the permit that are being modified are available to comment. Say if you're adding a new emissions unit, you can only receive comments on those new emission units, not any of the existing ones. So if you're looking to do this, how do you actually go through the e-business center to do this? The top screen is the, I guess you can call it the home page for air services. And there's an option on it for Title V PTO application, an initial renewal or modification. So if you click that where it's circled in red, it'll pull up the lower screen where it pulls up your facility and the reason for application. You would check the revision, then you would check one of the 6 square boxes below as they apply to you. So this is where you really would need to know which modification method you would have to go through. I also like to note there's also guidance on our webpage for the procedures to determine what kind of Title V modification you have to get. It also includes a 3-page flow chart that you just go through and answer a series of yes and no questions, and it will lead you to what modification procedure you have to use. So I encourage you to look at that. It's very good, and the flow chart will take you to exact modification procedure you need to use. So let's take another quick poll. Have you used the e-business center?
Okay, we've launched the poll, so please take a moment to answer yes or no. Okay, it looks like about 70% of you have responded. For those of you that have not responded, please go ahead and answer the question, and then we'll close the poll in just a moment. Okay, we're closing the poll, and I'll share the results with you, and I will turn it back over to Mike. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Cindy. So it looks like the majority of you have used the e-business center. That's good. It seems like everyone seems to be moving towards using the electronic system versus paper system. Seems to be the preferred route now. Okay, kind of jumping back to the significant permit modification. So the one question we typically have is if you have a significant permit modification, when can you start operating your facility with those modifications? So you have to ask yourself a couple questions. The first question is, would the operation of the change requested be prohibited by your current Title V permit? If the operation of the source and change can begin immediately after receiving the PTI, but the permittee must apply for a significant permit mod within 1 year required by PTI, that's if there's nothing that is prohibited in an existing Title V permit. If there is something in the permit that prohibits you from making this change, particularly if you have the emissions limit or it's some additional control equipment, then you cannot change until the significant permit mod is issued final. This scenario is typically covered by new emission units, where if you have a new emission unit, it's not in your Title V permit, so your Title V permit will not prohibit that emissions unit. And in this case, it would be covered by the PTI you receive. So the second step would be, could the source be operated in a way that would not be prohibited by the current Title V permit? So you can begin to change if you can operate the source in compliance with your current Title V permit, but you cannot operate the change until you get the significant permit mod. If you can operate it somehow within the constraints of your current Title V permit, you can operate it. Otherwise, you have to wait until the significant permit mod is issued final. And that has to go through all 4 steps again. All right, so now the last category is minor permit mod. What is a minor permit mod? Short answer, it's not a significant permit mod. So that's generally how it's defined. If it's not a significant permit mod or doesn't fall in any other categories, it's a minor permit mod. Cannot be a Title I modification, cannot violate any other terms you have in a PTI, cannot involve significant changes to existing terms or any case-by-case determinations. So the procedure to do this is you would submit your application in Air Services and include suggested permit language. Basically, the way we would get this is you would submit take a copy of your electronic copy of your existing Title V permit, and use the red line strikeout revision procedure in Word. If you do the track changes and make your changes in there, and do a red line strikeout of the permit and include that with your application. And when we receive that application, you can begin operation of the unit as included with your red line strikeout permit. Remember, the responsible official has to certify your application, and that's just the way the Air Services system also works. When this permit modification is processed, it does not have to go through all 4 steps. It just goes through the propose and final steps with no public comment period. But note that you actually can operate under your red line strikeout terms as soon as you submit the application. So we're going to look at any monitoring, record keeping, reporting changes to existing units. There's different procedures to go through depending on if you want to change those or how you want to change those, your monitoring, record keeping, reporting. If you would like to increase your monitoring or reporting frequency, you can do an administrative permit amendment. We'll skip and go to the significant permit modification. Is for significant changes to existing terms, or minor permit mod is less significant or insignificant changes to existing monitoring, record keeping, reporting. Once again, I refer you to the guidance that has it includes the decision tree, the 3-page decision tree that will help determine what kind of modification you should get. And as noted a little bit earlier, reopenings if there was a mistake or if you have some new monitoring and record keeping with the new rule. As I kind of noted before, is don't get caught up thinking of looking at your actual changes to the emission units or the actual physical changes you're making to the facility. For Title V purposes, you really want to look at how do you actually change the Title V permit? What needs to be revised in the actual Title V language? And also repeating again here, is if it's a minor permit mod or a significant permit mod, really I would look at the guidance that we have on our webpage. If you go to the permit resources tab on our webpage, and near the end, I believe there's 4 pages of different panes you can select. The Title V options are in the last pane. And if you click the Title V option, there'll be a pull down menu that allows you to pull the guidance that includes the Title V modification procedures. There's a listing that shows all the different options you have, all the scenarios that are associated with it. Plus, there's the 3 decision trees that go along with that. If you have a Title V permit, I would suggest becoming very familiar with that guidance if you're not already. And once again, if you have any questions in particular on those, by all means, contact your permit writer. And here's links to those guidance. The first link is for the guidance I've been referencing. That will take you directly to that guidance. And the fourth of the panes I was referring to on our permit resources page, if you go to the last page, this is a direct link to that pane I'm referencing. All right, now we're going to go back to Bob and review Title V permits and greenhouse gases.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time about greenhouse gases and how they are incorporated into the regulatory scheme, both for Title V and for PSD. Not all greenhouse gases are created equal, and one of the things that you need to look at is if you're dealing with these 6 particular pollutants, what is their equivalency? And carbon dioxide is the base of the greenhouse gases being equivalent to 1, but each of these specific pollutants has a particular greenhouse gas potency, and it's important to calculate the numbers if you are dealing with changes, a new permit or changes that associated with these specific pollutants to determine their greenhouse gas equivalency, or CO2e. So US EPA has the factors in the rules as to how to calculate the emissions and what the CO2e is, CO2 equivalency for the various pollutants. So one of the things that happened is that the first attempt for US EPA to start to permit greenhouse gases, US EPA treated greenhouse gases the equivalent of a new ambient air quality standard, essentially, for permitting purposes. And they set up, if there were certain emission levels above 100, might be above 100,000 tons for a facility that was just emitting for straight greenhouse gases, or if it was above 75,000 for a modification, it would either trip PSD, or just on its own, it could require a PSD permit. Well, that concept went through various court cases, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court made some decisions about how to look at greenhouse gases and in terms of the giant regulatory scheme. Well, first of all, in order for a facility to trip the greenhouse gas requirements for a facility, it has to be something that is going to be PSD for a criteria pollutant. And then it has to have federally enforceable greenhouse gas emission limits if it's greater than 75,000 tons per year. It needs to also have the best available control technology requirements. And after all that's done, within that PSD permit, there will be greenhouse gas limits, and then those greenhouse gas limits will be carried over to the Title V permit. So all of this is called step 1, or PSD anyway, for greenhouse gases. And that's how the Supreme Court decided. Instead of looking at it as an entirely new contaminant, what the Supreme Court did was put it into the same category as these other minor pollutants that go on under PSD, like fluorides or sulfuric acid mist. Only the trip levels are much higher than those pollutants. So it's treated as one of these minor pollutants. It's not treated as a NAICS, but yet US EPA does have the regulatory authority to regulate greenhouse gases associated with a PSD source that's building for criteria pollutants if it's above 75,000 tons per year. So once that happens, then the greenhouse gas will be incorporated into Title V, and it will have to have VCAC limits for those greenhouse gases. And the important thing, it only applies to new PSD sources, and the new is probably now maybe 5, 6, 8 years old. But we do not regulate greenhouse gas emissions from existing sources at this time. I'm not sure what the future holds, but we don't have 111D plans. That was also thrown out by the U.S. Supreme Court. So we aren't regulating greenhouse gases from existing sources at the present time. But for new PSD sources, we do. Now, one of the things that happened is that when US EPA first decided to regulate greenhouse gases, and I will use the term as a similar to a national ambient air quality standard pollutant, many facilities had synthetic minor conditions on them that Mike had described, synthetic minors. So we had a number of facilities that had synthetic minor restrictions based on greenhouse gases, so they didn't trip either PSD, or they, in particular, didn't trip the requirement to get a Title V permit for greenhouse gases. So one of the things, one of the questions that came up is, well, I received my synthetic minor permit that includes limitations on greenhouse gases, so I would not be a Title V. Can they be relaxed or removed? Yes, they can be, but you have to be a little bit careful, because those limitations on greenhouse gases were also restricting some kind of operations, some kind of limitations on the facility. So if those are removed, and then the facility has to be examined what the potential to emit emissions are for all the other pollutants, because greenhouse gases are no longer a requirement. So have to be a little careful when you do that to make sure that, oh, I got rid of my greenhouse gas emission limits because they aren't needed. However, I am now tripping Title V requirements for a criteria pollutant, or I'm tripping PSD for a criteria pollutant. So it's important to really take a close look at it and talk to the permit writer if you're interested in doing that. So what you may have to do is you may have to revise what the criteria emission limits are once that's done, and you might have to have a different restriction level on, say, SO2 or NOx, because the greenhouse gas requirement isn't the one that's tripping Title V permit and all. So you'll need to also submit a modification application for that to reflect that change, and it could end up being an installation or a Title V permit In some cases, maybe after the consideration of dropping the greenhouse gases, synthetic minor requirements, you find the case that you're going to need a Title V permit, but in fact, the Title V requirements aren't that significant or severe, that you can go forward and accept them too. So it's important to take a look at all aspects before you decide what path to go down. And US EPA has put out guidance on permitting greenhouse gases. And we also have specific rules in place as to how those are covered. We have a number of places to get information. One of the tools that we have are engineering guides. We have a number of engineering guides that have been issued over the years. And as described, these are guides. This is just information that's provided typically to the district offices and local agencies to answer questions about how the rules apply and things like that. So there are things to look at when you have specific requirements in place, particularly modeling. We have a pretty extensive guidance document out concerning application of dispersion modeling. You can look at our customer support center and see what kind of questions have been asked. Maybe that will help you out. There is online help for the e-business center. And we have also other guidance that Mike has talked about within our Ohio EPA website. Now, we have another quick poll, and this is going to be our last poll. Do you know who your district office or local agency contact is?
Okay, we are launching the poll, and please select yes or no. Thank you. Okay, about 70% of you have responded. For those that have not yet responded, please go ahead and submit your responses now, and we'll close the poll in just a moment. Okay, the poll is now closed. Thank you.
Okay. Almost 80% of you know who your district office or local agency contact is. That's good. For the other 20%, it is good to find out who that individual is that you're going to be dealing with and make contact with the district office or local agency and find out and talk to that person, know who they are, and just to the initial contact or potentially go over any questions you have associated with permits. Okay, we have a little bit of a hold up here, but we should be able to get to some of our additional slides. And it will be just a moment and we'll be back in business. Okay, key takeaways. The Title V permits are operating air permits for large facilities. And one of the things that maybe we didn't mention earlier on is this was all as a result of the 1990 amendments. Congress set up the Title V permit system to be a parallel to the NPDES permit system. So all state agencies had some sort of permit system, but Congress wanted a more uniform system in place with some uniform requirements. So they set up US EPA to develop the requirements for Title V permits, but then all states have to develop Title V permits. This is not a unique permitting system to Ohio. The Title V permits can be modified and must periodically be renewed. It is very important that you do not miss the deadline for submitting your Title V renewal. The whole concept of Title V is the Title V permit gives you the legal authority to continue to operate. And you must have that Title V permit in hand or a timely application filed for you to be legitimately operating your facility in accordance with US EPA's requirements. The Title V permit renewals can be applied no earlier than 18 months, but no later than 6 months. So, and we do send out a couple reminders to try to make sure that people do not have late Title V renewals, because that's something that sets up the company for potential enforcement for not applying timely. There's lots of information available on Title V's. If you are working on it for the first time, you might want to hire a consultant to help you out as far as filling out the application and determining what all the requirements are associated with that application. Here is some additional information. We do have first thing to do is find out who your permit writer is and talk to them at either our district offices or local air agencies. As I mentioned, talk to consultants. If you're dealing with consultants, make sure that they do have experienced people who have dealt with Title V permits, PSD, non-attainment, new source review, whatever the subject matter is, or air quality modeling, making sure that you are getting a person or a company that has some experience in the area that has worked with Ohio EPA. With that, we are going to have some time for some questions and answers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bob and Mike, and we're going to answer some of your questions now. And as a reminder, you can still submit some questions through the question and answer pane, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. And if we do not answer your question, we will reach out to you through email after today's session. So our first question, we had a couple of questions on attainment. The first one is, do you know what steps Columbus and Cincinnati took to get out of non-attainment for ozone?
Okay, I'll answer that one. Well, first of all, our division makes it a top priority that once we have clean data, once we have shown that our absolute air quality is attaining the standard, we make it a high priority to do all the work associated with it in order to get a redesignation in a request into US EPA. It's important for new source development. And once we get that data in after an area has been designated non-attainment and we have clean air data, we want it designated as soon as we possibly can. Now, what steps were taken? Well, there were a series of control measures that And no two areas are the same. As an example, the Columbus area, there is not much, there aren't any utility plants nearby, and there is not much industry. So the major impact on ozone in Columbus is going to be mobile sources, and some others, and both on-road and non-road, say construction equipment and things like that. There are a number of measures in place to reduce mobile source emissions, primarily set by the federal government for cleaner cars on into the future. So that was one of the key components for Columbus. For Cincinnati, Cincinnati was a little different. It has more of an industrial base and more utilities, but as you are probably aware, there are a number of utility plants that have, well, over time, utility plants have either had to install nitrogen oxide controls, typically catalytic reduction units, or they have shut down. We've had a number of power plants along the Ohio River shut down. So a combination of those two, along with some mobile source reductions, led to attainment in the Cincinnati area. In Cleveland, it's a little different. Cleveland's a little more complicated. Overall, it has a greater population. It is also up on the lake, and the lake can have certain effects on ozone formation. So the combination of that has made attainment of the ozone standard in Cleveland more challenging. Now, associated with that designation of moderate non-attainment that's going to be coming in Cleveland, Ohio EPA has adopted a number of rules to get further emission reductions that were required to do for US EPA, something called NOx RACT and VOC RACT. Plus some consumer products, updating the consumer products rules. So we're looking to try to get more emission reductions in the Cleveland area to try to get that area into attainment as soon as possible. But it's almost each area is a little different, at least in Ohio. Little differences in emission profiles that can lead to attainment or non-attainment, and particularly some geographic features too.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, if US EPA changes the particulate standard and my county becomes non-attainment, how will that affect my pending permit application?
And Mike, I can take this one also. It used to be that if you had a complete application in place for a major PSD permit, and the area was changed to non-attainment, US EPA would allow us to process that permit. But that has changed. So if you have a PSD permit for particulate matter and US EPA adopts a more stringent PM 2.5 standard, and you are in a county that is designated, that becomes designated non-attainment, then you would fall under the non-attainment requirements. Now, if it's the case where you have a project that you think could happen, or you're pretty sure that's going to happen, you might want to apply and get your permit, even though maybe the finances hasn't been all lined up. Because if you get a PSD permit and then the area is changed to non-attainment, that PSD permit is still good. And the process that's going to take place is US EPA is currently evaluating the particulate standards and whether or not they should be tightened. And although the recommendation from the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, the majority has recommended a tightening, we don't know yet how tight US EPA might ratchet down the standards. So Depending on what county you're in, it might be a county where even when they come out with the new standard, you'll still be attainment. It's just going to depend on where they set the level. But the but is, US EPA is going to have to come out and propose what that new standard is going to be. And then they're going to accept comment on it. Then they're going to have to adopt that standard. Now, the latest information we have is that US EPA may be able to get out a proposal yet this year, but certainly adoption will be in 2023. Once that standard is adopted, then we, the state, have to put together what our recommended attainment, non-attainment areas are. US EPA has to review those, propose those, and adopt those. So we are at least 2 years away from getting new particulate non-attainment designation. So if you have a project underway, we should be able to get you your permit before any new non-attainment for particulate matter kicks in.
Okay. The next question is, my facility is considering a major expansion. We do not yet have the details necessary to complete the permit application. When should I contact Ohio EPA to discuss this project? Do I need to wait until I have a complete application?
Mike, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. And interject more if you feel necessary. Basically, no, you don't have to. You can discuss with Ohio EPA if before you have a complete application. That's actually sometimes fairly common, where if you have a project, you can contact us and start to work with us to put together to get an application together so we can start drafting permit terms before you actually submit a complete permit application. So we can start to work with you a little bit here before submitting a total application if you don't have the plans completely finalized. Also, depending on what plans aren't finalized, I mean, you may not be able to actually finalize all your construction plans. As long as you can put together enough pieces for the application, you can go with that. But if you have a project out there, as soon as you feel comfortable discussing it with the Ohio EPA, by all means, I would recommend doing it. The sooner, the better.
Okay, thank you.
I was to say, I might add, we have worked on projects, and Mike has worked on projects where we have accepted applications in pieces, not in 50 different pieces, but in groups. If there's a large project and people can get together their certain aspects of the project to be submitted, maybe in 2 or 3 groups, for us to start the review process before the formal application is even submitted, as they're working on the various different source categories. So that can even be done, and that review process is underway. And also while the air dispersion modeling discussions are underway. So there are times when we will have all of the necessary paperwork for a complete application, and our staff will start reviewing it and drafting terms and conditions and all, but we will not have the final modeling done. But again, we will, if you have a major project, we are going to work with you to see how we can meet your specific time frame, so that we can get you a permit that is timely and complete and meets your time constraints, but yet is also fully acceptable and approvable.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, are NOx limitations likely to lower in the Cleveland area again for Title V facilities beyond what were lowered in this past March?
Okay, let me give this a try. We outlined certain requirements, and one of them is to review the NOx-RACT rules that are out there, and some facilities have individual NOx-RACT requirements, and those must be re-reviewed. What I don't know is if those specific site-specific NOx-RACT rules, if that re-review process, what the status is, how far it's gotten along. So, but if someone has a site-specific NOx-RACT, it will have to be re-reviewed to determine whether or not it is still considered RACT.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, if you're required to file a Title V permit renewal 6 months prior to expiration, what if you just filed a permit to install for a new piece of equipment?
Okay, if you have just submitted a PTI, you still have to have your renewal application in on time. That is one thing you absolutely have to do. If you are in the middle of processing a PTI, you can still submit your renewal application and then submit another application for that PTI after the fact. But absolutely, you cannot miss that deadline. It is critical. We can process them both at the same time, but you can't delay submitting your renewal until you get your PTI handled.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, and I apologize if I don't say this correctly, but is it the Quad O, the OOOC greenhouse gas regulations are in the comment stage, and the draft regulations require a state SIP plan within a short period of time, 12 months from final promulgation. Will you comment on this short time frame, and have you started to work on this?
Well, we are aware of what US EPA has put out in its supplemental proposal stage, but we do not have even what the final proposal is. So we have not started to put together our plan yet because we just are not sure of exactly how it's going to end up. I believe US EPA has received over 500,000 comments on that pre-proposal. So I'm not sure where they're going to end up even proposing a rule package, but we are aware of what the requirements are. And yes, it will be a challenge for our division once they are adopted to make sure we get those rules in place in time. And we'll have to examine our options once US EPA makes their final rule. But we want to see more what they are proposing to get a better sense of what those requirements are actually going to be.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, can you explain what a permit shield is and how it applies to Title V permits?
Mike, do you want to do that one? If you can, Bob, that would be better because
okay.
There's little issues on this one.
The whole concept of a permit shield, and going back to when the whole permit system was in place, and I mentioned how Congress puts it in the Clean Air Act in 1990, and US EPA develops the requirements for states to have Title V permit programs. The idea of a permit shield was that the whole purpose of Title V was to put in one document all the requirements that a facility would need to meet in order to be in compliance. And it sort of should work both ways, that if we have one document that has all of the requirements that sources have to comply with, and it's a complete, then that is the permit shield, that a facility should not be subject to an enforcement action for some sort of rule that wasn't in the Title V permit, that was, I would say, missed by the permitting authority. It is designed to be the entire package for the facility to operate under, and if they follow those requirements in that Title V permit, they should be good. They should not be subject to an enforcement action. So that's the idea of a, quote, permit shield and how it's supposed to work. And as Mike said, that permit shield extends towards the expiration of that permit after 5 years if someone has filed a timely renewal. Then that permit shield stays in place until the renewal permit is issued. So that does put the obligation on us, if we have to update that permit, that we get it done, because otherwise the facility is operating under the old Title V permit. But again, it's operating under the permit shield because that's what it was given, and it files for a timely renewal application.
Okay, thank you.
Unexpected sneezing and stuff going on there. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, Bob and Mike. I think that's all the time we have for questions today, but thank you for your great presentations, and thank you everyone for attending this 2022 Virtual Compliance Conference session. Now, before we end the day, we would like to point your attention to another one of today's fun facts. On this slide, we're highlighting Ohio EPA's Encouraging Environmental Excellence, or E3 program. The E3 program recognizes an organization's exceptional achievement in environmental stewardship. There are 3 program elements designed to enhance opportunities for recognition for Ohio businesses, nonprofits, colleges and universities, K through 12 public or private schools, and communities. You can scan the QR code on this slide to get more information about what type of E3 program is right for your organization and to apply today. And lastly, Ohio EPA hosts a series of webinars throughout the year on a variety of environmental topics. This slide provides information on how to register for these upcoming webinars, where to find the recordings of previous webinars, and how to sign up to receive notifications of upcoming webinars through our Ohio EPA Customer Support Center. And with that, we will end the session of Ohio EPA's 2022 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. We hope you can join us for other conference sessions. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.